Lily had never been a morning person. But somehow, waking up at 4:30 every day didn't bother her anymore. There was something peaceful about the empty streets, the way the city held its breath before the chaos began. She'd unlock the cafe door while stars still dotted the sky, flip on the lights, and start her routine. First the ovens, then the coffee machines, then the delicate work of arranging pastries that had been delivered an hour earlier. The cafe sat on a quiet street corner, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's orders by heart. Large windows wrapped around two sides of the building, letting in floods of morning light. Lily loved those windows. They made her feel less alone during those early hours when the world was still sleeping. Across the narrow alley stood an old bookstore, the kind that smelled like paper and time. She'd noticed it her first day on the job, admired its vintage sign, and the carefully arranged window displays, but she'd never been inside. Her schedule didn't really allow for browsing, and besides, she told herself she was too busy settling into city life to explore much. What she did notice, though, were the shadows. It started about 3 months into her job, right around the time the sunrise began shifting with the changing season. The angle of light would hit the alley just right, projecting her silhouette onto the brick wall between the buildings. She'd be arranging croissants or wiping down tables, and there on the wall would be her shadow, stretched and dancing. Then one morning, another shadow appeared. Someone was moving around inside the bookstore, visible through the back windows. The shadow was tall, angular, constantly in motion. Whoever it was seemed to be unpacking boxes, shelving books, doing the same kind of opening routine she performed in the cafe. At first, Lily didn't think much of it. Just another early riser, another person trying to make a living in the city. But days passed, and the shadow kept appearing. Same time, same movements, same dedication to getting things ready before customers arrived. She started paying attention. The way the shadow would pause sometimes, as if the person was reading a passage from one of the books. How it would move with careful precision when handling what must have been older or more valuable items. There was something gentle about those movements. Something that made her curious. Daniel had inherited the bookstore 8 months ago, and he still wasn't used to being the owner. Every morning he'd stand in the storage room, surrounded by boxes of books his grandfather had collected over 40 years, and feel completely overwhelmed. The old man had known every title, every author, could recommend the perfect book for any customer. Daniel was still learning, still trying to fill shoes that felt impossibly large, but he loved the quiet hours before opening. No pressure, no customers watching him fumble through the inventory system, no reminders that he was supposed to be writing his own novel instead of selling other people's stories. Just him and the books, and the slowly brightening sky. The cafe next door had new staff, he'd noticed. Through the gap in the buildings, he could see movement in the early mornings. Someone young, someone who moved through their work like a dance. He'd catch glimpses sometimes when he passed by the window, see the shadow on the brick wall between them. It became a game, almost. He'd time his unpacking so he'd be near the window when the light was right. He'd watch her shadow arranging things, wiping surfaces, moving with an efficiency that spoke of someone who took pride in their work. He wondered what she looked like, if she was as graceful in person as her silhouette suggested. Lily found herself doing the same thing. She'd invent reasons to walk past certain windows at specific times. Oh, she needed to check the back door. Oh, she should water the small plant on the windowsill. Oh, she'd forgotten to wipe down that particular table. All excuses to catch a glimpse of that mysterious shadow. Her coworkers thought she was just incredibly thorough. Her manager praised her attention to detail. Nobody knew she was really just trying to see if the bookstore shadow would appear, if those careful movements would play out on the brick wall one more time. 3 months of this. 3 months of shadows meeting while the people casting them remained strangers. Daniel knew nothing about her except that she arrived early and worked hard. Lily knew nothing about him except that he handled books like they were treasures. Sometimes their shadows would almost overlap on the wall, reaching toward the same point as they moved through their separate spaces. In those moments, Lily's heart would do this strange little jump. She'd tell herself she was being ridiculous. It was just a shadow, just someone doing their job. But still, She looked forward to it. Those few minutes each morning when their silhouettes would share the brick wall. When she felt less alone in the pre-dawn quiet. It was the strangest thing, feeling connected to someone she'd never met, whose face she wouldn't recognize if they passed on the street. Daniel felt it too. That odd sense of companionship with a person who was just an outline, just a shape made of blocked light. He started arriving earlier, just to have more time with that shadow on the wall. Neither of them knew that everything was about to change. Neither of them knew that a storm was coming. One that would finally force their shadows and their lives to collide. The forecast had mentioned possible rain, but nobody expected what actually arrived that Tuesday afternoon. The sky went dark around 3 o'clock, turning the city into twilight. Lily was restocking supplies when the first drops hit, fat and heavy against the cafe windows. Within minutes, it became a downpour. Customers rushed out, holding newspapers and bags over their heads. Her manager decided to close early. No point staying open when the streets were flooding. Lily started her closing routine, wiping tables and putting chairs up, when she heard a loud crash from the alley. She grabbed an umbrella and went to investigate. The downspout between the buildings had broken, sending a waterfall of rainwater directly onto a stack of cardboard boxes behind the bookstore. The boxes were already soaking through, and she could see books inside them. Old books, the kind that don't survive water damage. Without thinking about it, Lily dropped her umbrella and grabbed the top box. It was heavier than expected, waterlogged, and falling apart. She managed to drag it a few feet toward the bookstore's back door when someone appeared beside her. He was tall, maybe early 30s, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by rain. His shirt was already soaked through, and he looked panicked. This had to be the bookstore owner. The person who cast that careful shadow every morning. They didn't introduce themselves. There wasn't time. He grabbed one side of the box she was holding, and together they hauled it toward his door. Then they went back for another, and another. The rain was relentless, turning the alley into a stream. Lily's shoes squelched with every step. Water ran into her eyes. But she kept moving. Some boxes were beyond saving, their contents already pulp. Others they managed to rescue just in time. Daniel, though she didn't know his name yet, moved with desperate energy. These weren't just books to him, she could tell. They meant something. 15 minutes of frantic work, and they'd saved what they could. Daniel pulled her inside through the back door, both of them dripping puddles onto his storage room floor. They stood there, breathing hard, looking at each other properly for the first time. His eyes were kind, even exhausted and worried as they were. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow and smile lines around his mouth. Something about him felt instantly familiar, though Lily couldn't explain why. The power chose that moment to die, plunging the bookstore into darkness. Daniel swore softly, then apologized. He fumbled for his phone, using the flashlight to navigate through the shop. Lily followed him to the front, where he found some emergency candles his grandfather had kept under the counter. The flickering light transformed the space into something magical. Shadows danced across the shelves, across the stacks of books that rose like towers toward the ceiling. It smelled like old paper and leather, and that particular mustiness that comes with truly loved books. Daniel disappeared into a back room and returned with towels and dry clothes. A sweatshirt and pants that would be too big on her, but better than staying in wet things. He pointed her toward the bathroom, and she changed quickly, grateful for the warmth. When she emerged, he'd set up 2 chairs near the candles and was pouring hot tea from a thermos. He'd changed too. His hair still damp, but his clothes dry. They sat down, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then Lily started laughing. She couldn't help it. The whole situation was absurd, running through a storm to save books she'd never read, sitting in a dark bookstore wearing a stranger's clothes, drinking tea by candlelight like they were in some old movie. Daniel looked startled at first. Then he started laughing too. It was a good laugh. Genuine and warm. When they finally caught their breath, he extended his hand. "I'm Daniel. I should have led with that." "Lily," she said, shaking his hand. "I know," he said, then looked embarrassed. "I mean, I've seen you, through the windows, in the morning. I've seen you too, Lily admitted. Your shadow, anyway. On the wall, they looked at each other, and something clicked into place. This was the person she'd been watching for months. The careful shadow, who handled books with such care, and she was the graceful silhouette he'd looked forward to seeing each dawn. The storm raged outside, rain hammering against the windows. But inside the bookstore, everything felt strangely calm. They talked, while the candles burned lower. He told her about his grandfather, about inheriting this place and feeling lost. She told him about leaving her small town, about needing to escape somewhere. Nobody knew her story. He showed her some of the books they'd saved, explained why they mattered, first editions, rare prints, things his grandfather had spent decades collecting. She understood then why he'd looked so panicked. This wasn't just inventory, it was legacy. As the evening wore on and the storm finally began to ease, Lily realized she didn't want to leave. Not yet. There was something about Daniel, about the way he listened when she talked, the way his whole face lit up when he discussed books he loved. When the power flickered back on, they both blinked in the sudden brightness. The magic of candlelight disappeared, replaced by regular fluorescent bulbs, but the connection they'd formed didn't fade with it. Daniel walked her to the door, and they stood there awkwardly, not quite ready to say goodbye. Thank you, he said finally, for helping. You didn't have to do that. I couldn't just leave the books to drown, Lily said. Besides, I'm glad I finally met the person behind the shadow. He smiled at that, and she noticed how it changed his whole face. Come by sometime, he said. When you're not rescuing my inventory, I'll recommend you something to read. I'd like that, Lily said, and meant it completely. The next morning, Lily arrived at the cafe at her usual time, but everything felt different. She kept glancing toward the bookstore, wondering if Daniel was there yet, if his shadow would appear on the brick wall like always. When it did, she found herself smiling. Around 7:30, the cafe door chimed. Daniel walked in, looking slightly nervous. He ordered black coffee and asked what pastry she'd recommend. Lily gave him her favorite, a chocolate croissant that their baker made special on Wednesdays. He thanked her, paid, and sat by the window with a book. This became their new routine. Every morning, Daniel would come in, order coffee, and take whatever pastry Lily suggested. Sometimes it was items on the menu. Sometimes things she'd convinced the baker to try. He trusted her choices completely, and she loved that responsibility. After a week, she started slipping him extras. A new cookie recipe she wanted his opinion on. An extra shot of espresso because he looked tired. Little things that let her take care of him without making it obvious. He started bringing her books. The first one was a collection of short stories about people starting over in new cities. He'd left a note inside the cover saying he thought she might relate to some of the characters. She read it in 2 days and loved every page. Their morning conversations stretched longer. 5 minutes became 10, then 15. Her manager noticed but didn't mind. Daniel was becoming a regular, and regulars were good for business. What the manager didn't notice was how Lily's whole demeanor changed when he walked through the door. How her smile became real instead of professional. They talked about everything. Daniel learned that Lily had grown up in a town where everyone knew everyone's business, where she'd always felt like she was playing a role instead of being herself. The expectations had suffocated her, made her feel like she was drowning in other people's ideas of who she should be. Moving to the city had been her escape, her chance to figure out who she actually was. Lily discovered that Daniel had always wanted to be a writer. He had notebooks full of story ideas, chapters of novels he'd never finished, characters who lived in his head but never made it fully onto the page. His grandfather had encouraged him, told him he had talent. But Daniel had never believed it enough to really try. Inheriting the bookstore had felt like a sign at first, a way to stay connected to stories, to his grandfather's memory. But lately, it felt more like an anchor. He loved the books, loved recommending the right story to the right person. But part of him wondered if he was hiding, using the shop as an excuse not to take the risk of writing his own work. One morning, about 6 weeks into their friendship, Lily brought up the shadows. They were sitting at her favorite table, the one by the big window, and she mentioned how strange it was that they'd been meeting for months without knowing it. Daniel's face lit up. I used to time my unpacking schedule just so I'd be by the window when the light was right, he admitted. I wanted to see your shadow on the wall. I did the same thing, Lily said, feeling her cheeks warm. I'd invent reasons to walk past certain windows. My coworkers probably thought I was obsessed with cleaning. They laughed about it, but underneath the humor was something else, an acknowledgement that they'd been drawn to each other even before they'd met. That some connection had existed in those shadow meetings that neither of them fully understood. Daniel started staying later at the cafe, lingering over his coffee until Lily's morning shift ended. A few times, she'd join him on her break, and they'd sit together talking until she had to get back to work. Her coworkers teased her gently about her bookstore friend, but Lily didn't mind. She liked having something that was just hers, just theirs. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments. When a customer ordered black coffee, when she saw someone reading on the train, when the morning light hit the brick wall, just right. He was becoming important to her, in a way that both excited and scared her. Daniel felt it too. He'd catch himself watching the cafe even when he knew Lily wasn't near the window. He'd think of her when he came across a book she might like, or when a customer reminded him of something she'd said. Writing came easier when he thought about her, words flowing onto the page in a way they hadn't in years. One afternoon, he actually started writing about her, not directly, but a character inspired by her grace, her quiet strength, the way she'd run into a storm to save books that weren't even hers. The character took over his story, becoming central to everything else. He wrote 20 pages in one sitting, more than he'd written in months. Lily started keeping a small notebook, jotting down thoughts and observations about her new life in the city. She found herself writing about Daniel, about their conversations, about how strange and wonderful it was to connect with someone so easily. She'd never been good at opening up to people back home, always worried about judgment. But with Daniel, everything felt natural. They were building something. Both of them could feel it. Something more than friendship. Though neither had quite acknowledged it out loud, it hung in the air between them during their morning talks, in the way he'd save her a specific table by the window, in the way she'd make his coffee exactly how he liked it without having to ask. Her friends from back home wouldn't recognize her anymore, Lily thought. She'd become braver here, more herself. Part of that was the city, the anonymity and freedom it offered, but part of it, a big part, was Daniel. He made her feel like being herself was not just okay, but actually interesting, worth knowing. For Daniel, Lily represented possibility. She'd taken the risk he was too scared to take, leaving behind everything familiar to chase something better. She believed in him in a way that made him want to believe in himself. When she talked about the characters in books he recommended, her insights were so sharp, so genuine, that he started to think maybe his own writing could matter to someone too. They were falling, both of them, even if they hadn't named it yet. Falling into something that felt inevitable, like their shadows had known all along what their hearts were just beginning to figure out. But happiness is fragile, and the past has a way of showing up exactly when you least expect it. Daniel's ex-girlfriend arrived on a Tuesday, appearing in the bookstore right before closing like she'd never left. Her name was Victoria, and she looked exactly the same, polished, confident, wearing success like it was tailored specifically for her. She'd gotten a promotion, she told him. Her company was expanding, and she'd be in the city for a few months, managing the transition. Lily saw them through the bookstore window that evening. She'd been walking home from a late shift, and happened to glance over. Victoria was touching Daniel's arm in that casual way people do when they have history together, when they've been intimate in ways that leave invisible marks. He looked surprised, maybe uncomfortable, but he wasn't pulling away. Something cold settled in Lily's stomach. She kept walking, told herself it was none of her business. They were friends, that's all. Daniel could talk to whoever he wanted, but the image stuck in her head all night, playing on repeat like a song she couldn't escape. She didn't know the history. Didn't know that Victoria had broken up with Daniel 2 years ago because she'd wanted more and he'd felt like less. She'd been moving up in her career while he'd been stuck working retail, trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. The imbalance had poisoned things, made him feel inadequate, and her feel held back. Daniel had spent months after the breakup trying to prove he was worth something. He'd thrown himself into writing, but every rejection letter confirmed what he'd feared, that he wasn't good enough. When his grandfather died and left him the bookstore, it felt like a consolation prize for a life that hadn't gone as planned. Now Victoria was back, and she'd changed her mind. She'd realized that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. She'd grown up, she said. Learned what actually mattered. She wanted to try again, if he'd let her. Daniel didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. He was too shocked, too confused by her sudden reappearance. They talked for hours that first night, catching up on 2 years apart. She was different, softer somehow. She actually listened when he talked about the bookstore, about his writing attempts. She apologized for making him feel small back then. Lily showed up at the cafe the next morning and went through her routine on autopilot. When Daniel came in for his usual coffee, she was friendly but distant. Professional. She didn't ask about his evening, didn't suggest a pastry, just took his order and moved on to the next customer. Daniel noticed immediately. Something had shifted, and he didn't understand what. He sat at his usual table, but Lily didn't join him on her break. She stayed busy behind the counter, avoiding eye contact. He tried again the next day, and the day after that. Same result. Polite, but cold, like they'd gone back to being strangers. The easy warmth they'd built over weeks had disappeared overnight. And Daniel had no idea why. What he didn't know was that Lily was drowning in old insecurities. Seeing Victoria, seeing how put together and successful she looked, had triggered every fear Lily thought she'd left behind in her hometown. She was just a cafe worker, nothing special. Daniel was educated, ran a business, wanted to be a writer. What had she been thinking? Imagining there could be something between them. Victoria was the kind of woman who belonged in Daniel's life. Accomplished, sophisticated, someone who could match him intellectually. Lily was the girl who'd barely made it out of her small town, who was still figuring out basic city life. She'd been fooling herself, getting attached to someone out of her league, so she pulled back, protected herself the only way she knew how. Better to end things now, before she got hurt worse. Better to remember him as a friend and nothing more. Daniel was lost without their morning conversations. He'd gotten used to starting his day with Lily, to her smile, and her recommendations, and the way she really listened when he talked. The bookstore felt lonelier now. Even with customers around, he'd pick up his phone to text her, then remember she'd been distant and put it away. Victoria noticed his distraction. She'd see him staring out the window toward the cafe, see how he'd lose track of conversations. One evening, she asked him directly if there was someone else. Daniel said no automatically, but it wasn't true. There was Lily, even if they'd never defined what they were to each other. There was the way his heart would jump when he saw her shadow on the brick wall, the way he'd started writing again because she made him believe in himself. There was everything they'd built in stolen moments between coffee orders and book recommendations. Victoria knew him well enough to read the lie. She looked at him sadly and said what he needed to hear. "You're not in love with me anymore. Maybe you never were. Not really. We were together because it was comfortable, because it made sense on paper. But your heart isn't here." Daniel wanted to argue, but he couldn't. She was right. Whatever he'd felt for Victoria had been real once. But it was long over. His heart was across the alley, behind a cafe counter, belonging to someone who wouldn't even look at him anymore. Victoria left the next morning, took her second chance offer with her. She told him to go after whoever had captured his attention, to not waste time the way they had. Life was too short for comfortable love when real love was possible. But the damage was done. Lily had seen them together, had drawn her own conclusions. And Daniel, nursing rejection and confusion, had convinced himself she'd never been interested anyway. He'd misread the signs, projected his own feelings onto friendly gestures. For a week, their shadows still met on the brick wall each morning. two silhouettes dancing around each other, coming close, but never quite touching. The people casting them moved through their separate spaces, both miserable, both convinced the other didn't care. The shadows knew better, though. They'd known from the beginning. Sunday mornings were quiet in the neighborhood. The cafe didn't open until 8. The bookstore stayed closed. It was the one day of the week when the alley between them belonged to nobody. Just empty brick and shadows without people to cast them. Daniel hadn't slept well all week. Every night he'd replay conversations with Lily, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. He'd written dozens of texts, and deleted them all. What could he say that wouldn't sound desperate or pathetic? She'd made her disinterest clear, and he needed to respect that. But Sunday morning, something broke inside him. He couldn't keep living like this. Couldn't keep wondering what if. Even if she rejected him completely, at least he'd know for certain. At least he'd have tried. He gathered supplies, feeling ridiculous but determined. A thick blanket, coffee in a thermos, 2 cups, and a letter, 4 pages he'd written and rewritten a dozen times, trying to get the words exactly right. He spread the blanket in the alley, right where their shadows met each morning, and sat down to wait. Lily had been awake since 5, restless and unhappy. She'd tried reading, tried watching something on her phone, but nothing helped. Finally, she gave up and decided to go into the cafe. Baking helped when her mind wouldn't settle. She could lose herself in measuring flour and kneading dough. Let the familiar motions quiet her thoughts. She unlocked the cafe door and flipped on the lights. Through the back window, she saw him. Daniel. Sitting in the alley on a blanket, like he was waiting for a sunrise picnic. Her heart stuttered in her chest. For a moment, she considered pretending she hadn't seen him, going about her baking and ignoring whatever this was. But she couldn't, even hurt and scared, even convinced it would end badly. She couldn't just leave him sitting there. She walked out the back door and crossed the alley. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and the hope in his eyes nearly broke her. "Hi," he said quietly. "Hi," she answered, wrapping her arms around herself even though the morning wasn't cold. He held up the letter, pages covered in his handwriting. "I wrote you something. You can read it yourself, or I can read it to you. Or we can just throw it away and pretend I'm not completely losing my mind." Despite everything, Lily smiled a little. "Read it to me." So he did, right there in the alley while the sun started to rise. He told her everything. About Victoria, about how seeing his ex again made him realize he'd been using their failed relationship as an excuse not to take real risks. He'd let fear rule him for 2 years, convinced himself he wasn't good enough for success or love, or any of the things he actually wanted. Then Lily had appeared, first as a shadow, and then as a real person who was braver than he'd ever been. She'd left behind everything familiar to chase something better. She'd run into a storm to save books that weren't hers. She'd made him want to be better, to try harder, to believe he could actually write something worth reading. He'd started his novel because of her, he told her. Not about her exactly, but inspired by her courage, by the way she moved through the world, like she was determined to build something new. She'd become the reason he got up early. The reason he looked forward to mornings. The reason he started believing maybe he could be more than just his grandfather's replacement. Victoria leaving again had been a relief, he admitted, because it forced him to see what was true. That his heart hadn't belonged to his ex in years. That somewhere between shadows on a wall and coffee recommendations and late evening conversations, he'd fallen completely in love with someone else. With Lily. With her grace and strength and the way she made the world feel less lonely. With her kindness and her smile and the way she really saw him, not as a failed writer or a bookstore owner by default, but as someone with potential, someone worth knowing. He finished reading and looked at her. Vulnerable and exposed. "I don't know why you've been distant this week. Maybe you figured out how I felt and it scared you. Maybe I'm completely wrong about everything, and you've never seen me as more than a friend. But I had to tell you. I couldn't keep carrying this around and pretending I was okay." Lily was crying, tears running down her face even though she was smiling. She dropped to her knees on the blanket beside him and took his face in her hands. "You're not wrong," she whispered. "You're not wrong about any of it. Then she kissed him, and it was like everything clicked into place. His arms came around her, pulling her close. And for the first time in a week, Lily felt like she could breathe properly. She'd been so stupid, so caught up in old fears that she'd almost lost this. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she told him her side of it. About seeing him with Victoria, and panicking. About all her insecurities rushing back. About feeling like she wasn't good enough, wasn't interesting enough, wasn't enough, period. Daniel looked at her like she'd said something absurd. "You're everything," he said firmly. "You're the reason I wake up happy. You're the reason I'm writing again. You make me want to be braver. To take chances. To believe I can actually do the things I've only dreamed about." They sat together on the blanket while the sun rose higher, talking about everything they'd been too scared to say before. Lily told him about her hometown, about being the girl who never quite fit the mold everyone wanted to force her into, about how lonely it had been, feeling like she had to perform a version of herself that wasn't real. Daniel understood that more than she knew. He'd felt the same way with Victoria. Always trying to be someone more successful, more ambitious, more everything. It had exhausted him, made him feel like he was failing even when he was doing fine. With each other, they didn't have to pretend. Lily could be uncertain and still figuring things out. And Daniel loved her for it. Daniel could be scared of failure and still trying anyway. And Lily loved him for that. They fit together in a way that felt easy, natural, like their shadows had known all along. The sun hit the brick wall behind them, casting their silhouettes in that familiar spot. But this time, the shadows weren't separate. They merged together. Two forms becoming one in the morning light. "Our shadows were smarter than us," Lily said, watching them on the wall. "They figured it out months ago and just waited for us to catch up." Daniel laughed and kissed her again, softer this time, like he was savoring it. 3 months of shadow meetings, all so we could end up here. "Was it worth the wait?" she asked, even though she knew the answer. "Completely," he said, pulling her closer. "Though I'm glad we finally got our act together." The shadows were probably getting impatient. They stayed there until the neighborhood started waking up, until the quiet Sunday morning gave way to people and noise and regular life. But everything felt different now. Brighter somehow. The alley between their buildings wasn't just a passage anymore. It was the place where their shadows had met first, where they'd found each other without knowing it, where they'd finally admitted what had been building for months. Daniel walked her back to the cafe, their hands intertwined. They made plans for dinner that evening, a real date this time instead of stolen moments between work shifts. Lily promised to finally visit the bookstore properly, to let him show her his favorite sections and recommend books without time constraints. As she unlocked the cafe door, she turned back to him. "Thank you for the letter. For being brave enough to say everything out loud. Thank you for not running away when you saw me sitting in the alley like a crazy person," he said, grinning. She kissed him once more, quick and sweet, then slipped inside to start her baking. Through the window, she watched him walk back to the bookstore, and her heart felt full in a way it never had before. Their shadows would meet again tomorrow morning, like they had for months. But now the people casting them knew what they'd known all along, that some connections are inevitable, that sometimes you find each other in the most unexpected ways, and that love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it starts with shadows touching on a brick wall, waiting patiently for hearts to catch up.